On the 17th of June 2020, a team of geneticists at Trinity College Dublin published a finding so strange that even the lead scientist on the project said she had never seen anything like it in her entire career. They had been quietly sequencing ancient DNA pulled from human remains buried inside Newgrange, a 5,000-year-old stone monument in Ireland that is actually older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Buried right in the most sacred, most elaborate chamber at the very heart of that monument was the skeleton of an adult man. And when the scientists read his genome, they noticed something deeply unsettling. Every single one of us inherits two copies of our genetic code, one from our mother and one from our father. In a normal, healthy population, those two copies are noticeably different from each other. But this man's two copies were almost identical, practically a mirror image of one another, which meant only one thing. His parents were not just related, they were first-degree relatives, either full siblings or, more disturbing still, a parent and their own child. Now stop and think about what that actually means. This was not some accidental, isolated incident hidden in the family tree of a random farmer. This man had been placed in the single most important, most sacred chamber of one of the most extraordinary monuments ever built in ancient Europe. A monument whose entrance is perfectly aligned so that on one single morning each year, the winter solstice, a beam of sunlight travels all the way down its long stone passage and floods the inner chamber with golden light. According to the researchers, throughout the whole of human history, this kind of first-degree incest has almost only ever shown up in one very specific context, among ruling elites who considered themselves so far above ordinary people that they were willing to break one of humanity's oldest and most universal taboos in order to keep their bloodline pure. The same kind of incest practiced by Egyptian pharaohs, the same kind practiced by the god kings of the ancient Inca Empire, and now, seemingly, by whoever this man was, buried in the beating heart of Newgrange nearly 5,000 years ago, in a quiet corner of Ireland long before anyone had ever heard of pyramids, pharaohs, or Incan god kings. Just let that timeline sink in for a second. Newgrange was already standing, already fully built, before the first stones of the Great Pyramid of Giza were ever laid in Egypt. This wasn't some crude pile of rocks either. It's a 200,000-ton feat of prehistoric engineering, precise enough that, more than 5,000 years after it was constructed, it still perfectly channels a beam of sunlight down its passage on one specific morning every single year, without fail. And now, buried at the very center of that achievement, scientists had just found genetic proof of a taboo so extreme, so universally forbidden across nearly every human culture in history, that its presence alone completely rewired how archaeologists understood the society that built the place. Whoever ordered this man's burial in that exact spot knew exactly who his parents were, and that alone tells you they wanted the world, or whatever world existed 5,000 years ago, to know it too. And here's where the story gets even stranger. Local Irish folklore, first written down in the 11th century, thousands of years after Newgrange was actually built, tells a bizarre myth about a builder king who supposedly restarted the daily cycle of the sun by sleeping with his own sister. The medieval Irish name given to the neighboring passage tomb at Doath Ferte Trele literally translates to Hill of Sin. For centuries, historians assumed this was simply a strange piece of folklore, disconnected from any real historical event. But when modern geneticists sequenced the DNA of a man buried inside Newgrange's inner chamber and found genetic proof of first-degree incest, that old myth suddenly did not sound quite so much like fiction anymore. This is where our story about Irish DNA truly begins, because what this single discovery represents is only the tip of a much bigger, much stranger iceberg. Over the last decade, a wave of groundbreaking genetic studies coming out of Trinity College Dublin, Queen's University Belfast, and the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin have completely rewritten what we thought we knew about where the Irish people actually came from, what shaped their unique biology, and why even today, in the 21st century, you can still trace the outline of ancient kingdoms and Viking invasions hidden inside the DNA of modern Irish men and women. And just to make things even more dramatic, a brand new 2025 study looking at that same Newgrange evidence has now thrown the whole incestuous God King theory into serious doubt, suggesting the truth might actually be something completely different. So today, we are going to walk through this entire genetic detective story from the very beginning. And by the end, you will understand exactly why scientists say Irish DNA is one of the most unique, most revealing genetic records found anywhere on the planet. Let's rewind first, back beyond Newgrange, back beyond the Bronze Age, back to the very first people who ever set foot on the island of Ireland and left a genetic trace scientists could actually recover. In late 2015, a team led by geneticist Laura Cassidy at Trinity College Dublin, working alongside archaeologists from Queen's University Belfast, achieved something that had never been done before. They successfully sequenced the very first whole genomes ever recovered from ancient Irish human remains. Their subjects were a Neolithic farming woman buried in a megalithic tomb near Belfast around 3343 to 3020 BC, roughly 5,200 years ago, and 3 men from the early Bronze Age, buried on Rathlin Island off the northern coast of Ireland, dating to somewhere between 2026 and 1534 BC, close to 4,000 years ago. What they found inside that Neolithic woman's DNA immediately overturned decades of assumptions. Her genome was overwhelmingly of Near Eastern origin, meaning her ancestors ultimately traced back to the Middle East, the exact same region where farming itself was first invented thousands of years earlier. She did carry a small amount of older hunter-gatherer ancestry, but the dominant genetic signal running through her body was that of an agricultural population that had slowly spread out of the Fertile Crescent, moved across the Mediterranean and through mainland Europe, and eventually crossed the sea to reach the shores of Ireland. In other words, the earliest farmers of Ireland were not simply local hunter-gatherers who happened to pick up farming techniques from their neighbors. They were at least in large part descendants of actual migrants who had walked, sailed, and settled their way all the way from the Middle East to the very edge of Western Europe. This finding alone settled a genuine, long-running controversy inside archaeology. For decades, researchers had debated 2 competing theories about how farming actually spread across Europe. One theory argued that farming was primarily an idea, a set of techniques and tools that spread from community to community through simple cultural contact, with existing hunter-gatherer populations gradually adopting the new lifestyle without much actual migration involved. The other theory argued that farming spread mainly through migration itself, real farming populations physically moving into new territory and, over time, largely replacing or absorbing the hunter-gatherers who had lived there before them. By sequencing this one Neolithic woman's genome, Cassidy's team found direct physical evidence supporting the migration theory, at least as far as Ireland's western edge of the story is concerned. Farming, it turns out, did not simply travel to Ireland as an idea. It traveled inside the bodies of the people who carried it there. But it was the second half of that same study, the 3 Bronze Age men from Rathlin Island, that delivered the genuinely shocking twist. Roughly 1,500 years after that Neolithic farming woman lived, these 3 men showed something completely different running through their DNA. A massive infusion of what scientists call steppe ancestry, genetic material tracing back to nomadic herder populations who originated from the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea into southern Siberia, a region known as the Pontic Steppe. Roughly a third of these Bronze Age men's entire genetic makeup came from these steppe populations, a level of genetic change so significant that researchers described it as evidence of a population upheaval that swept all the way from Central Asia to the farthest western edge of Europe. This was not simply new ideas or new tools spreading through trade and cultural contact. This was real people, entire populations worth of them, physically migrating enormous distances and profoundly reshaping the genetic makeup of an island thousands of miles from where their journey had begun. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. All 3 of these Bronze Age men carried the exact same Y chromosome lineage, a genetic marker called R1b M269, the very same Y chromosome type, strongly linked to that steppe migration sweeping across the rest of Europe. Today, this specific Y chromosome lineage remains, by an enormous margin, the most common male genetic lineage found across the entire island of Ireland. Think about what that actually implies. Somewhere around 4,000 years ago, an entirely new wave of male ancestry arrived in Ireland and became so dominant that even today, thousands of years later, it remains the primary male genetic signature of the modern Irish population. The genetic fingerprint of the earlier Neolithic farming population that built extraordinary monuments like Newgrange did not vanish completely. But when it came to which male lineages successfully passed down through countless generations all the way to the present day, the Bronze Age steppe newcomers overwhelmingly won out. This is where the story turns genuinely uncomfortable because researchers studying similar steppe migrations elsewhere across Europe have suggested this kind of near-total replacement of local male lineages was rarely a gentle, peaceful process. Whatever happened on the ground in Ireland during this period, whether it involved outright violence, disease, social upheaval, or simply a demographic imbalance that gradually tipped the scales generation after generation, the genetic result was dramatic, and from the perspective of the earlier population's male line, close to total. Female lineages, traced through mitochondrial DNA, tended to show a more mixed picture across much of Europe during similar steppe expansions, suggesting that in many places, women from the earlier population continued having children within the new arriving communities, even as the earlier male lines quietly disappeared from the historical record. The same genetic upheaval also appears to be responsible for several traits that people around the world now think of as classically, almost stereotypically, Irish. The genetic variant responsible for lactase persistence, meaning the ability to digest milk comfortably well into adulthood, something a huge percentage of the world's population actually cannot do, shows up prominently at this exact point in Irish genetic history. So does the genetic variant associated with blue eyes. And so, strangely enough, does a specific gene mutation called C282Y, which causes a disorder known as hereditary hemochromatosis, a condition where the body absorbs and stores far too much iron from food, which can eventually cause serious damage to the liver, heart, and other organs if left untreated. This particular mutation shows up at such a strikingly high frequency among people of Irish descent that doctors and geneticists sometimes nickname it the Celtic disease, or the Celtic curse. And remarkably, the Rathlin Island Bronze Age genomes represent the very first time this specific disease-causing genetic mutation has ever been detected directly inside ancient human remains anywhere in the world. In other words, a disorder that still quietly affects a meaningful percentage of Irish people today, sometimes without them ever realizing it, can be traced directly back to the single dramatic wave of migration that swept across the island roughly 4,000 years ago. Think about what that really means for someone alive right now. Somewhere in Ireland today, and among the enormous Irish diaspora scattered across America, Britain, Australia, and beyond, there are people quietly walking around with a genetic time bomb ticking away inside them, one that traces its origin directly back to a handful of Bronze Age herders who crossed an entire continent roughly 4,000 years ago. Left undiagnosed, hemochromatosis can slowly poison the body with its own iron, damaging joints, organs, and eventually proving fatal if it goes untreated for long enough. And yet, until Cassidy's team pulled ancient DNA out of a handful of bones on a small island off the northern coast of Ireland, nobody had ever actually seen that specific mutation preserved directly inside human remains from prehistory. It had always existed only as a modern medical statistic. Now, thanks to ancient DNA, doctors and geneticists can trace the exact moment in deep history when this quietly dangerous piece of Irish biology first entered the population. So already, before we even circle back to the mystery hiding inside Newgrange, we can see that Irish genetic history is nowhere near as simple as most people assume. It is not one continuous, unbroken population that has occupied the island since time immemorial. It is a layered story, farmers arriving from the Near East, then, centuries later, a completely different wave of steppe-descended herders sweeping in and reshaping the genetic and cultural landscape all over again, possibly even bringing with them the earliest roots of Celtic language itself. Now let's go back to Newgrange, because in 2025, a new study published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal took a much closer, much broader look at the wider genetic picture surrounding that original incest discovery, and the results complicate the neat, dramatic God-King story in a genuinely fascinating way. This newer research examined ancient DNA recovered from 55 individuals buried across various large stone passage tombs throughout Ireland, tombs built between roughly 3900 and 2500 BC, including some of the most famous sites in the country, Newgrange itself, along with Noath and Doath. And when researchers led by Neil Carlin looked closely at the genetic relationships among the people buried in these communal tombs, they found something that pushed back directly against the original dynastic elite interpretation. The vast majority of individuals buried together inside these tombs were not, in fact, close biological relatives of one another at all. According to Carlin and his colleagues, there simply is not enough genetic evidence to support the idea that these tombs were the final resting places of one single dynastic bloodline that deliberately restricted burial access only to their own relatives. Instead, the picture that emerges looks far more like a broader, more communal society, one where access to these enormous, labor-intensive monuments was not necessarily locked behind bloodline and hereditary privilege the way a ruling God-King dynasty would demand. As Carlin himself put it, describing the underlying society, this was a more equal society than the original incest headline had implied. That does not erase the strange and genuinely unusual finding of first-degree incest inside the Newgrange chamber itself. That piece of the puzzle remains just as real and just as documented as it was back in 2020. But it does suggest that the leap from one unusual incestuous individual to an entire ruling dynasty of Egyptian-style god-kings running Neolithic Ireland may have been a larger leap than the original dramatic headlines led on. Kinship, the newer researchers argue, needs to be understood as something broader and more complicated than pure biology alone, shaped just as much by social relationships, shared belief systems, and communal identity as by who was and was not somebody's blood relative. So, which version is correct? Honestly, the most likely answer sitting underneath all of this research is that both studies are capturing real, genuine pieces of a much more complicated truth. Yes, there does appear to have been some kind of unusually elevated, possibly even sacred or specially chosen status attached to certain individuals like the man buried in that inner Newgrange chamber whose extraordinary incestuous parentage sets him apart from almost every other prehistoric skeleton scientists have ever examined anywhere in Europe. But that does not necessarily mean all of Neolithic Ireland was ruled by one single, continuous, incestuous royal bloodline in the way Egyptian pharaohs or Inca emperors were. It may instead reflect something more localized, more symbolic, tied to specific individuals viewed as spiritually significant, perhaps connected to those extraordinary solar alignments these monuments were built around, rather than an entire hereditary political dynasty holding power generation after generation. Either way, one thing is undeniable. This one strange genetic result, first-degree incest hiding inside a 5,000-year-old skeleton, managed to reopen an entire academic debate about power, hierarchy, and society in prehistoric Ireland that experts are still actively arguing about today. There's something almost poetic about how this argument keeps circling back on itself. In 2020, one skeleton convinced the world that Neolithic Ireland was secretly ruled by god kings hiding a dark, incestuous secret at the very heart of their most sacred monument. 5 years later, a much wider genetic survey of the very same tombs pushed back hard against that dramatic conclusion, arguing for something closer to a shared communal society. And the honest truth is that neither team of scientists is claiming to have the final, complete answer. Science rarely works in one single dramatic headline. It works exactly like this. One discovery forcing researchers to ask sharper questions, followed by a second, broader discovery forcing them to reconsider what they thought they already understood. Somewhere in the space between those two competing interpretations sits the real, messy, complicated truth about who these people were. And until more ancient genomes are recovered from more sites across the island, that argument is likely to keep evolving for years to come. Let's fast forward now, because the story of Irish DNA does not stop in the Bronze Age. It keeps evolving, layer after layer, all the way up into the modern era. And some of the most fascinating discoveries about Irish genetics actually come from studying living people today, rather than ancient bones pulled out of the ground. In 2017 and 2018, a team led by geneticist Giampiero Cavalieri at the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin published the results of what became known as the Irish DNA Atlas, built from detailed genetic analysis of nearly 200 modern Irish individuals with deep, well-documented ancestral roots stretching back for generations in specific regions of the country. What they found was nothing short of remarkable. Genetic clusters within the modern Irish population lined up almost perfectly with the island's traditional historic provinces: Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, and Munster, regional boundaries that, in some cases, trace all the way back to ancient Gaelic kingdoms. 7 out of 10 distinct genetic clusters identified in the study aligned closely with populations of pure Gaelic origin, while 3 others clearly reflected historical mixing with British ancestry. But the single most striking result of all was a sharp, unmistakable genetic boundary slicing directly across the northern part of the country, cleanly separating Ulster from the rest of Ireland. This wasn't some vague, gradual genetic gradient blending smoothly from one region into another. It was a sharp, high-contrast line, almost like an invisible wall running straight through the landscape, similar in strength to the kind of genetic barrier you would typically expect to see created by an actual physical obstacle, a mountain range or a wide river, rather than simple historical settlement patterns. And astonishingly, this same genetic divide didn't stop at separating Ulster from the rest of the island. It actually cut directly through Ulster itself, distinguishing populations in the northwest from populations in the northeast, hinting at deeply rooted, centuries-old tribal and political identities still quietly written into people's DNA today, long after the kingdoms themselves have faded from living memory. To put that in perspective, researchers directly compared the strength of this genetic divide to similar fine-scale mapping work carried out across England, Scotland, and Wales as part of an earlier project called the People of the British Isles Study. And the Irish result stood out dramatically. The degree to which these genetic clusters accurately predicted centuries-old historical boundaries turned out to be remarkably stronger in Ireland than in most of England, a country many times larger in both population and land area. Some of these clusters lined up almost precisely with the borders of specific medieval Gaelic kingdoms, like Dalkais and the Eoganacht within the province of Munster, ancient political territories that most people today have never even heard of, yet whose fingerprints are still detectable in the blood of their modern descendants. Researchers also found that the genetic clusters showed no significant connection to differing amounts of ancient Irish ancestry passed down from the Neolithic or Bronze Age populations we talked about earlier, meaning this fine, detailed regional structure was not simply an ancient signal preserved by accident. It reflects something that happened much more recently, shaped largely by centuries of medieval and early modern history, when people tended to live, marry, and die within a fairly narrow radius of wherever they were born. The Irish DNA Atlas also uncovered the first solid genetic evidence confirming something historians had always suspected from written records and archaeological finds, but had never actually been able to prove directly through DNA, that Vikings genuinely did intermingle with the local Irish population during their raids and settlements along Ireland's coastline. Populations connected to historic Viking trading towns like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick showed measurable genetic traces linking back to Scandinavian ancestry, physical proof, written directly into modern Irish genomes, of a chapter of history that had previously existed mostly in old manuscripts, sagas, and archaeological digs. And then, in March of 2025, researchers pushed this modern genetic mapping project even further. A study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics analyzed haplotype data, meaning inherited chunks of DNA passed down largely intact through generations, from over 6,500 individuals across Ireland, using an advanced computational technique called Leiden community detection to identify hidden genetic groupings within the population. What this newer, much larger study revealed was almost unsettling in its own quiet way. Modern haplotype data actually shows that certain regions of Ireland, specifically the southeast and the west of the country, are today less genetically connected to each other than you might expect, evidence of what researchers describe as a recent migration barrier. In plain terms, this means that even in relatively modern history, right up through the 19th and into the 20th century, people in these regions were simply not moving around, marrying and mixing with each other, nearly as much as you might assume in a small, closely connected island nation. Centuries of localized rural isolation, limited transportation, minimal urban migration, and communities that tended to marry within their own local area, layer upon layer of small-scale social patterns, quietly built an invisible genetic boundary that modern scientists can still detect clearly in DNA collected within just the last few years. What makes this particular finding so unexpected is the timing. We are not talking about some ancient tribal boundary drawn thousands of years ago and slowly fading with time. We are talking about a genetic signal shaped largely within the last few hundred years, well within the era of roads, railways, printed maps, and eventually cars and telephones, technologies that, in theory, should have made it easier than ever for people from different regions to meet, marry, and blend their family lines together. And yet, the data tells a different story. Right up until surprisingly recent history, huge numbers of people across rural Ireland were still living, working, and forming families, almost entirely within a fairly tight radius of wherever their own parents and grandparents had lived before them. It's a quiet, almost invisible reminder that even in an increasingly connected modern world, deeply local generational patterns of community and marriage can leave a genetic fingerprint every bit as real and detectable as any ancient migration event from thousands of years earlier. Step back for a moment and take in the full scope of what this means. A visitor walking around modern Ireland today sees a small, tightly connected island, easy to drive across in a matter of hours, filled with people who all share a national identity, a national flag, a shared modern history. But buried underneath that shared modern surface, quietly encoded inside people's DNA, are the fading but still detectable outlines of Bronze Age population upheavals, ancient Gaelic kingdoms, ferocious Viking raiders who decided to settle down and start families instead of simply raiding and leaving, and centuries of small, quiet, local isolation that most people walking around today have absolutely no conscious awareness of whatsoever. Your own DNA, if you happen to have deep Irish roots, might be quietly telling a story about your ancestors that no family history book, no old photograph, and no oral family legend ever managed to record. So here's the truly wild part of this entire journey, when you step back and look at it as one continuous story. It begins with farmers walking out of the Middle East roughly 7,000 years ago, slowly making their way across an entire continent until they reached the very edge of the known world. Those farmers eventually built astonishing stone monuments like Newgrange, monuments so precisely engineered that they still perfectly track the exact position of the sun thousands of years later, down to the very same day of the year. Then, centuries after that, an entirely new population swept in from the grasslands of Central Asia, effectively replacing the dominant male genetic lineage across much of the island, and quietly leaving behind a disease causing gene mutation that still affects Irish families today, hidden inside their own blood without most of them ever realizing where it actually came from. Layered on top of all of that came Viking raiders turned settlers, medieval Gaelic kingdoms, whose old borders still show up in modern DNA testing kits, and centuries of quiet rural isolation that shaped who married whom, right up into remarkably recent history. And somewhere in the middle of that entire 5,000-year saga sits one single, deeply strange skeleton, buried in the beating heart of one of the most extraordinary monuments human beings have ever built, carrying inside his own genome genetic proof of an ancient taboo so unusual that it managed to reopen a scientific argument about power, hierarchy, and society that experts are still actively fighting over today, more than 5,000 years after he first drew breath. That Right there is really the heart of why scientists keep saying Irish DNA is so genuinely unique. It is not simply one story. It is layer stacked upon layer, each wave of migration, each cultural upheaval, each quiet century of local isolation, leaving its own permanent fingerprint behind, all of it still readable today, sitting quietly inside the blood of millions of people who call Ireland home, whether they live on the island itself or trace their roots there from anywhere else across the globe. And the truly remarkable thing is that scientists are still actively decoding new chapters of that story right now, in real time, with fresh studies challenging old assumptions almost every single year. Consider just how much has already changed in the space of one single decade of research. Before 2015, nobody had ever successfully sequenced a whole ancient Irish genome at all. The deep origins of the Irish people were still largely a matter of educated guesswork stitched together from archaeology, language, and folklore. Within just 10 years, scientists went from having 0 ancient Irish genomes to reconstructing detailed population upheavals stretching back 7,000 years, uncovering a case of first-degree royal incest that rewrote assumptions about Neolithic society, mapping out genetic boundaries between medieval kingdoms still visible in living people today, and then watching a newer generation of researchers turn around and challenge their own earlier conclusions with fresh evidence. That is not a settled, finished field of study. That is a live, ongoing scientific detective story, and every year brings the very real possibility of another skeleton, another genome, another discovery capable of rewriting the story all over again. So the next time somebody tells you that a small, quiet island like Ireland could not possibly have a genetic history this dramatic, this layered, or this scientifically important, you can tell them about a 5,000-year-old skeleton buried in the heart of a monument older than the pyramids, whose own DNA managed to shake up an entire academic field, and about millions of ordinary people walking around today, completely unaware that their own blood is quietly still telling the story of farmers, herders, Vikings, and kings who lived and died thousands of years before any of them were ever born.